You are sitting on a $600,000 commuted value offer from your defined benefit pension, and on paper, the safe move looks obvious. Just keep the monthly check coming. But for some of Canada's largest public sector plans, the inflation protection you are counting on has never actually kicked in. Not once in almost 20 years. This is not a typo, and it is not some rare exception. It comes down to a clause called conditional indexing, buried in the plan documents, tied to a funding threshold. Most members have never been asked to check. I used to believe every public sector pension was bulletproof too. Then I went and pulled the actual funding reports, and the picture looked nothing like what gets handed out at retirement seminars. Indexing sounds automatic, like a raise that shows up every year without you asking. It is not automatic on plans like this one. The gap between a pension that truly indexes and one that only indexes once a distant funding target is met can be worth thousands of dollars a year, every single year, for the rest of your life. So before you decide whether to take the commuted value or keep the monthly check, you need to know which kind of pension you actually have. The fix for a pension that never indexes is not the fix a standard retirement calculator will hand you. I want to walk you through the real math, starting with what happened to a group of teachers who assumed their pension moved with the cost of living, the same way most of us assume ours does. If you are working through a pension decision right now and you want the real numbers instead of the brochure version, hit subscribe. I am going to show you how to check your own plan's funding status and what to do if the answer is not the one you were hoping for. The word hiding all of this is indexing. Most people assume it happens every year on its own, like a cost of living raise. Here is what is actually going on underneath that word. Take the Nova Scotia Teachers' Pension Plan. Indexing there has been conditional since 2006, and the condition is that the fund has to be at least 90% funded before any inflation increase gets paid out. That threshold has never been met. So a teacher who retired back in 2007 has received zero inflation increases for almost 20 years. On a $40,000 annual pension, that is roughly $8,000 of purchasing power quietly gone, in real terms, and it keeps growing every year the fund stays under that line. Here is the part that catches people off guard. That teacher's pension statement still shows the same $40,000 it always has. Nothing on the page looks broken. The check clears every month, exactly on time, for the exact same amount it was 5 years ago and 10 years ago. It feels stable. It is stable in the number. It is not stable in what that number can actually buy. OMERS, one of the country's largest pension plans, suspended its own indexing entirely between 2012 and 2015, then only partially restored it afterward. Members were told their pension was protected against inflation. For 3 years, in practice, it was not. If your pension is with OMERS, Nova Scotia Teachers, or any plan that uses the words conditional indexing in the fine print, this is not about you missing something you should have caught. These plans do not put that condition on the front page. It is written the way pension documents are usually written, technically accurate, but not exactly advertised. I had a client who was public sector, 25 years in, completely convinced her pension was indexed, because every plan she had ever heard of talked about inflation protection somewhere in the handbook. She had never read the amendment from 2006. It took 15 minutes on the phone with the plan administrator to find out she had never once received an increase. Here is why this happens, and it is not because anyone is trying to trick you. Conditional indexing lowers the plan's long-term liability. The plan sponsor, meaning the employer or the government backing it, carries less risk when indexing depends on a funding target instead of being automatic. That is a reasonable thing for a plan to build in. The cost of that choice, the part nobody puts on a pamphlet, lands entirely on the member. You are the one who absorbs 20 years of inflation if the fund never crosses that line. So if your pension is not indexing the way you assumed, the real question becomes what you do next. That is where the decision to take a commuted value instead gets interesting, but only once you understand the real cost of walking away from that monthly check. Here is the part: the commuted value brochure does not spell out clearly. Your pension does not just hand you a lump sum equal to whatever the plan calculates it is worth. Only part of that lump sum can move into a locked-in retirement account, tax-sheltered. The rest comes out as cash, taxed as regular income the same year you retire. The portion that can move tax-free is called the maximum transfer value, and it is set by a government formula, not by you or your plan administrator. Take your annual pension amount and multiply it by an age-based factor. At age 55, that factor is around 10.4. At age 60, it climbs to about 11.5. By age 64 or 65, it reaches roughly 12.4. So picture a $50,000 annual pension at age 60. Multiply that by 11.5, and the maximum transfer value comes out to $575,000. If your actual commuted value offer is $700,000, the extra $125,000 does not get the tax shelter. It lands on your tax return as ordinary income the same year, stacked on top of whatever else you are earning. That is where people get caught. Marlene was 58, worked in the Ontario public sector, and had a salary and severance of $95,000 the year she retired. Her commuted value carried $167,200 of excess cash that could not shelter into a locked-in account. Because that excess stacks directly on top of her salary, it gets pushed into the highest brackets available. Run it through the combined federal and Ontario rates, and that excess alone triggers roughly $75,000 in tax, an average rate above 45%, with the top slice taxed at 53.53%. The plan only withholds about 30% at source, so Marlene owed the difference the following tax season, a bill she had not budgeted for. She did have one thing working in her favor. She had $60,000 of unused RRSP room sitting on her notice of assessment, room she had never gotten around to using. By transferring that much of the excess directly into her RRSP instead of taking it as cash, she sheltered it from that year's tax entirely, saving close to $29,800. This is the trade-off nobody puts in the retirement seminar slides. Every dollar of commuted value above the maximum transfer value is a decision point, not a formality. Get the timing and the RRSP room wrong, and a large tax bill shows up before you have spent a cent of the money. But here is the part most comparisons skip entirely, and it costs people more than the tax bill ever does. What happens to your health coverage the moment you walk away from that monthly pension? Most commuted value comparisons stop at the tax bill. They never touch the benefit you are also giving up the moment you walk away from that monthly pension, which is your employer-sponsored health, dental, and vision coverage. For someone between 55 and 65, replacing that coverage privately runs somewhere between $5,000 and $8,000 a year on your own, and closer to $8,000 to $12,000 a year for a couple. Most provincial drug programs do not open up until age 65, so there is a real gap to fill in the years before that. Picture losing $8,000 a year in health, dental, and vision coverage for the 10 years between an early retirement and turning 65. That gap alone adds up to $80,000 in extra costs nobody put on the original comparison sheet. Using a typical 4% safe withdrawal guideline for however many years you need that income to continue. Replacing it would take roughly $200,000 of dedicated savings sitting untouched, doing nothing but producing that one benefit. Suddenly, a pension that comes with health coverage attached is not obviously the worst deal, even sitting next to a lump sum that outperforms it on paper. This is not meant as a scare tactic. It is a line item nobody puts on the spreadsheet, because the pension administrator does not send you a bill for the coverage you are about to lose. I remember sitting with a couple who were 56, excited about taking a $650,000 lump sum and moving on. Then we added up their prescriptions, about $400 a month for blood pressure and cholesterol medication. Their employer plan had been covering 80% of that. A private quote came back at $650 a month, with a 3-month waiting period on anything considered pre-existing. That extra $7,800 a year changed the entire shape of their decision. So even if you have the RRSP room to absorb the tax bill, and even if you are confident you can invest the locked-in money well, you still need a way to replace the inflation protection your pension is not giving you. That is where a much smaller, much quieter account comes in. If your pension is not indexed the way you assumed, you need a separate way to protect your spending power, and the most tax-efficient tool for that job is your TFSA. Here is the idea. Draw your LIF or RRIF at the minimum required rate, and let your TFSA sit as a separate bucket you tap specifically when inflation has quietly eaten into what your pension check is actually worth. Start by calling your plan administrator and asking 2 specific questions. What is the plan's current funding ratio, and what is the exact indexing policy written into the plan text? Do not assume. Get it in writing. Next, work out your inflation gap. A $40,000 pension losing 2% a year to inflation is losing about $800 of real value in year 1 alone, and that number compounds every year the pension stays flat. Over a couple of decades, that gap does not stay small. It is completely normal to look at your pension statement, see the same number as last year, and think that means everything is fine. That reaction is not wrong. It is just incomplete. The pension is stable in the number printed on the page. Your grocery bill, your property tax, your car insurance renewal, none of those are standing still. Try shifting how you think about the number. Instead of telling yourself your pension pays you $40,000, tell yourself your pension pays you $40,000 in today's dollars, and you need a separate toggle switch for the years that dollar buys less. That toggle switch is your TFSA. Here is roughly how it can work. Say you are 55 with a $40,000 non-indexed pension and $100,000 already sitting in a TFSA, invested in a diversified mix of equities earning something like 5% a year after inflation. Left alone until 65, then drawn down carefully after that. A portfolio like that can support withdrawals in the range of $4,000 a year, adjusted upward with inflation, for 30 years or longer. That is not a guarantee. It is a rough shape of what a couple of decades of compounding can do for a bucket built specifically to chase the inflation your pension will not chase for you. The 2026 TFSA contribution limit is $7,000 a year, which is not enormous on its own, but stacked year after year against a pension that never moves, it becomes the mechanism that keeps your real income from quietly shrinking. Compare that to CPP and OAS, both of which are indexed automatically. In 2026, OAS at 65 pays $743.05 a month, and CPP's average new benefit at 65 sits around $831.58 a month. Those two move with inflation without you doing anything. Your workplace pension might not. The TFSA is how you build yourself the same protection by hand. But even with that bucket in place, the clock on your locked-in money keeps running. Your LIRA has to convert into a LIF, or an annuity, by the end of the year you turn 71, and tucked inside that deadline is a narrow window most people never hear about until it has already closed. Once your money sits in a locked-in retirement account, it cannot stay there forever. By the last day of December in the year you turn 71, it has to convert into a life income fund or an annuity. That deadline is fixed. The part almost nobody diarizes is what opens right after that conversion happens. Both Ontario and the federal pension rules give you a one-time chance to unlock half of that locked-in money, starting at 55, but only inside a 60-day window that begins the moment your funds land in the new LIF. Miss that window and the door closes. In Ontario, you file Form 5.2 within those 60 days to withdraw or transfer up to half. Under the federal rules, that unlocked half moves into an RRSP or an RRIF instead of straight cash, but you get full flexibility over it from that point forward. If your total locked-in balance is small enough, you may not need to wait for that narrow window at all. In Ontario, any locked-in account under 40% of the year's maximum pensionable earnings, which works out to $29,840 in 2026, can be unlocked in full. Under the federal rules, that threshold is 50% of the same figure, or $37,300. Here is what the two paths actually look like. Miss the 60-day window, and your money stays fully locked inside the LIF, capped by a minimum and maximum withdrawal formula for the rest of your life, with less room to respond if a large expense shows up. Catch the window, and half of that balance moves somewhere with none of those restrictions, while the remaining LIF sets you up later for pension income splitting once you turn 65. By age 71, the LIF also carries a minimum withdrawal you cannot avoid, 5.28% of the balance that year, following the same table used for RRIFs. Getting the sequencing right before that point changes how much of your retirement income ends up taxed, and when. This is where the timing gets genuinely interesting. Take LIF and RRSP dollars first in your early 60s, and let CPP and OAS sit and grow, and you can lower the tax bill across a 40-year retirement instead of just the next few years of it. Here is why spending your LIF and RRSP money first, in your early 60s, can be the better order of operations. Every year you delay CPP past 65, your payment grows by 8.4%. Wait the full 5 years to 70, and your CPP payment ends up 42% higher than if you had started it at 65. OAS grows too, by 7.2% for every year you delay, up to age 70. While you wait, you are not sitting without income. You are drawing down the LIF and RRSP dollars you already have at a point in your life when your other income is often lower than it was while working, which means those withdrawals get taxed more gently than they would if you delayed everything and stacked it all later. There is another piece that only shows up once you turn 65. LIF income counts as eligible pension income, which unlocks the $2,000 federal pension income credit, and it lets you split up to half of that income with your spouse on your tax return. Time the LIF withdrawals to start at 65 instead of earlier, and that splitting can meaningfully lower what you owe as a couple. I do not know every detail of your specific plan, your spouse's income, or your health. But if you are within 5 years of retiring, this order, LIF and RRSP money first, CPP and OAS held back, and a TFSA bucket running underneath the whole thing as your inflation toggle, is the structure I would start from. Filling in the exact numbers is yours to do, ideally with your own plan documents open in front of you. If this kind of coordination matters to you, subscribe. I go through this sequencing in detail on this channel, and I do not skip past the hard parts just to land on a neat answer. So here is the shape of it, start to finish. Call your plan administrator and ask directly about your funding ratio and your indexing policy. Do not assume the brochure language covers it. If a commuted value is on the table, work out the maximum transfer value using your age factor before you commit to anything, so you know your tax exposure ahead of time instead of discovering it at tax season. Check your notice of assessment for unused RRSP room, because that room is what shelters the excess portion from a heavy tax hit. Invest the locked-in money with a real multi-decade horizon in mind, and mark the deadline to convert it into a LIF by the end of the year you turn 71. Build a TFSA bucket specifically to cover the years your pension's real value slips behind inflation, And when it comes time to draw income, take the LIF and RRSP money first, and let CPP and OAS wait as long as you reasonably can. You earn this pension. Whether you end up keeping the monthly check or taking the commuted value, you deserve to know what you are actually getting, not what the brochure implies you are getting. That is what this channel is for. Real numbers for people who want clarity going into retirement, not more confusion. Tell me in the comments, does your plan have conditional indexing? I am keeping track of which plans actually trigger their inflation clauses in practice, and I would like to hear what you have found in yours.